Good morning, and welcome to today's event, Airpower After Ukraine, the Future of Air Warfare. My name is Matthew Kranig. I'm the acting director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. This event launches the Scowcroft Center's newest essay series, which draws interim lessons from the ongoing air war in Ukraine and considers the applications for 21st century air and space forces. The series features 14 air power experts and practitioners examining topics ranging from air control and supporting flyers, to intelligence sharing, to space and cyber operations. I'd like to thank our speakers and audience for joining us today, and our authors for their insightful contributions to this timely series. Here at the Atlantic Council, the Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. We also seek to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Consistent with that mission, the Center's Forward Defense Practice Area shapes the debate around the greatest military and defense challenges facing the United States and its allies, and creates forward-looking assessments of the trends, technologies, and concepts that will define the future of warfare. So what are we here to do today? As the ongoing conflict in Ukraine makes abundantly clear, the future of warfare is rapidly changing. Ukraine's ability to wage an asymmetric air campaign against a numerically and qualitatively superior foe provides valuable lessons for U.S. and allied defense planners. Emerging technologies and new ways of war are challenging existing doctrines, operational concepts, and procurement policies. And as the United States and its allies and partners observe and learn from the ongoing war, China and other U.S. adversaries are also taking notes on Russia's military successes and missteps. To prevail in tomorrow's wars, air and space forces must first master the lessons taught today and rethink or adapt traditional paradigms of war. Our 14 authors apply observations from the ongoing war in Ukraine to the future of air warfare. Across the essays, 5 major themes emerge: the democratization of air power, the return of mass to air and space operations, the power of international and cross-sector partnerships, the advantages in fighting across seen and unseen battlefields, and the challenge of operating in a cross-domain environment. Today, our speakers will delve into these topics and more. We're very pleased to be joined by Lieutenant General Clinton Highnote for a fireside chat on the future of air warfare. General Highnote is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy, Integration, and Requirements in the U.S. Air Force, making him the senior Air Force officer responsible for representing the voices of tomorrow's airmen. Serving as the head of Air Force Futures, he focuses on developing Air Force strategy and concepts, conducting strategic assessments of the operating environment through war games and workshops, manifesting an integrated future force design, and achieving timely and effective operational capabilities required for tomorrow's airmen to fight and win. Moderating the discussion will be Kelly Grieco, a senior fellow of the Stimson Center's Reimagining Grand Strategy program, and a leading author and editor of the series Airpower After Ukraine that we're presenting today. Following the fireside chat, we'll be joined by a distinguished panel of national security experts. They include General Philip Breedlove, an Atlantic Council board director and former Supreme Allied Commander Europe and commander of U.S. European Command. We're also pleased to have August Cole, an Atlantic Council senior fellow and author of best-selling national security novels such as Ghost Fleet and Burn In, and Lieutenant General Vera Lynn Jamieson, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, and Cyber Effects Operations in the U.S. Air Force. Our panel will be moderated by Lieutenant Colonel Tyson Wetzel, also a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center and an author and editor of this series. Just a few housekeeping notes. This event will be public and on the record. We encourage our audience on Zoom to ask questions using the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Our moderators will be moderating and collecting these questions, and we will answer some of them at the end of this event. Since this event is public, please be sure to identify your name and affiliation with the questions you submit. We also encourage our audience to join the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag Forward Defense. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to our moderator, Kelly Grieco. Thank you again for joining us, and Kelly, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at home or wherever you are located online. I am a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, and I'm honored to, as part of the launch this morning, to be moderating a fireside chat with Lieutenant General Clint Highnote. General, thank you for very much for being here today, and I'm very much looking forward to a lively conversation.
Kelly, thank you so much. I'm really excited about this project and the work that you and your fellow authors did in putting it together. I had a chance to read over the essays over the weekend and really impressed. And I want to commend them to everybody who is interested in thinking about what Ukraine is teaching us about air power. I want to congratulate the Scowcroft Center for Defense and the work that has gone into this. I think it's really helpful in moving the conversation forward. I'm hoping we can do that today.
Excellent, thank you. And on that note, before we get into sort of more, detailed, specific questions, I want to take a moment and just ask you, what are sort of your general impressions from, the air war now that we're 6 months into it? What has surprised you the most, or you've seen as sort of the most interesting developments, either technologically or doctrinally, to emerge from the war?
Oh, it's a big subject, and I wouldn't want to narrow it down too much there. I think some things that we all have taken away is how complex military operations are in our time. In modern conflict is complex. It is also clearly logistically challenging. And one of the things that we try to do with our team at Air Force Futures is to always remember the importance of logistics. We typically start our war games with a seminar on logistics, and we have to think through what that looks like over a expected period of several battles, maybe even a long-term conflict. And then we typically end with a assessment of logistics, and we try very hard not to hand wave logistics in our war games. It's something that is it's hard to do, but we find that if you don't think about it in peacetime, it's going to be really hard to do it in wartime. I think Russia found that out, and so logistics in modern warfare, without a doubt. And I think the last theme of these articles is something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is, what does all domain really look like in modern warfare? And I think the articles correctly identify both the incredible value of it and the fact that we're going to need to master this form of trans-domain or all-domain warfare. And then if you can, it gives you tremendous advantage. Not unlike, say, for example, what Germany had at the beginning of World War II, because they weren't the first to invent combined arms maneuver, but they were the ones who got the most advantage out of it. And early in the war, it clearly made a huge difference. I think we're going to see trans-domain or all-domain being very similar going forward, but it also is really hard, and Russia's finding that out right now, and we're going to continue to see how hard it is. And as somebody who is thinking about joint all-domain command and control, who is thinking about how we get from our current doctrine, which is really very centered on domains, to a doctrine that feels very fluid in domains, I see a lot of challenge there. I also see a tremendous benefit if we can do it. And so we're going to keep doing it. And but I think that Ukraine offers a very cautionary tale in that.
Excellent. So I think we'll probably be picking up on a number of those themes, as we move forward in the conversation. I wanted to sort of focus it around, from the 14 essays, we identified these sort of 5 common themes, and I wanted to ask you for your thoughts about some of them, starting with the first one about the democratization of air power. This notion that, in the past, barriers to accessing and exploiting the air domain were really high. Only really major powers could do that. But we've seen, proliferation of cheaper, increasingly advanced technologies lower those barriers to entry. And as Colonel Bremer and I argued in our essay on the series, we've seen Ukraine really exploit these trends to successfully practice a strategy of air denial using defense and vertical depth approach that's allowed it to deny Russia's manned aircraft freedom of movement over most of Ukraine, while simultaneously allowing it to also operate its own increasingly unmanned assets in what we term the air littoral, that airspace below where high-end fighters and bombers traditionally operate. So I want to ask you, is the Air Force thinking about air denial or air denial as a viable mission set? Or is that only for the Army in its ground-based air defense role?
No, so I'll answer that really, really quickly. We are absolutely thinking about the concepts behind air denial. Let me walk through a little bit of a chain of thought here, because I think it is really important for all of us as we think about the role of air power in modern conflict going forward. The first thing I'd say is this idea of democratization of flight is bigger than the military. And I have had a chance to see some incredible leaders in this field, folks that are thinking about, for lack of a better term, flying cars or delivery of key logistics through the air, and using what you have termed the air littorals as the major, you could think of that as the lines of communication or the roadways in the sky that allow us to do something with our economy that is different than what we have right now, to really democratize the access to flight. That's going to be really critical for our, not just the military, but our economy as well. I think we're the leaders in this field. We have to continue to be the leaders in this field. And we have to think about what flight looks like for the United States and for the free peoples of the world. I think it's going to change the way we trade. I think it's going to change the way we travel, change the way we think about our lives. And I'm really excited about that. As you can probably tell, the actual democratization in the military sense gets us to this idea of what does superiority feel like in modern conflict. Typically, we think of superiority as a duality. So we are going to use the space and we're going to deny its use to others. And what I think your article gets after that I do absolutely agree with is the barriers to entry for denial, for denying the use of airspace, are much, much lower these days than the barriers to entry for extending control and keeping control of the airspace. I actually think that leads to a very interesting question. And the question in my mind is there a chance, is there a situation in modern conflict where mutual denial of a space is good for someone operationally and strategically? And I might argue, and I'm going to use my experience in wargaming to make this argument. I believe that given the strategic position of the United States going forward, i.e., we are defending, we want to see the status quo continued. We don't want to see China come over the Taiwan Strait and invade Taiwan or to send missiles toward Japan. We don't want to see a resurgent Russia attack into a NATO ally. And because of this, we're proponents of the status quo. That's what we want. A military ought to reflect that. Our military capabilities ought to reflect that. And there may be a sense that mutual denial is good for us. And maybe if that's true, that ought to lead us to rethinking what types of capabilities we're fielding. One of the authors talked about that our current model of extending air power into another country is very much you go after the centers of power. And what we have found in our war games is maybe that's not what we need to do, that politically that's not what we need to do. And it may well be that mutual denial is good, i.e. it deters our potential adversaries from moving against our friends. If that's true, then we need to have a military that can achieve mutual denial, even at the edges of the battle space, even on the doorstep of our adversaries. And clearly that's what we're seeing when we see a place like Ukraine and what that could mean for a NATO ally. The last thing I'd say about this, and I really commend your ideas of thinking through what air denial is looking like. I actually think that our potential adversary, China, has written deeply about what it believes are the prerequisites for victory, for success in military operation. They believe that you need to be able to establish air superiority, maritime superiority, and information superiority. And that they would typically kind of lump cyberspace and electromagnetic spectrum and other types of information operations in that information superiority. So if we could prove that we can mutually deny air, maritime, and information, The logical conclusion is that our potential adversary never gets to the point where they're ready to go, where they're ready to start something we don't want to see started. If that's true, then I think this idea of mutual denial, especially in those three spaces, is key. And our military has to be able to convincingly show Russia and China specifically that we can deny the things they were going to need to be successful. Ukraine has clearly denied air superiority, and that has allowed them to stay in the fight. It's really interesting to see how low that barrier to entry was. So again, Kelly, great job on the article. I'm excited about the conversations it's going to spur on.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I will just note, though, that, I mean, what you're talking about is really a radical paradigm shift in American air power thinking. It's really moving away from sort of the Duhay model of gaining air superiority to, I would suggest, more Julian Corbett's notions of denial. And as you suggested, it requires rethinking the kinds of capabilities the Air Force might pursue. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about that. What would that Air Force potentially look like that was aiming for mutual air denial?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I'd say is air power has never just been about Duhay. And for those of you who may not be following the nuances of air power theory, there are lots of air power theorists who have influenced the development and use of the air for military purposes over time. Duhay is one of the ones who comes to the fore because he made a very convincing argument. You go attack their people, they'll stop fighting. And that has not proven to be true, by the way. There are lots of other theorists who I think are more holistic in their way of thinking. There was a young officer in the Army Air Corps way back when named William Sherman, who wrote an incredible book about a holistic view of air power. So I always say, look, we don't have to own Duhay. Duhay was Duhay. He thought what he thought. And we are thinking like we need to think today. Mutual denial in the air. What does it take? Well, it clearly is going to take some sense of awareness about what's going on in the air, because, or at least denying that awareness to your adversary. It's clearly going to take some ability to project power into the air and affect it there. Now, it's not going to matter what domain that projection comes from. And you're going to not worry about it. Increasingly, you don't mind if the effect of mutual denial comes from the land. Clearly, that is happening today. And that's one of the big parts of what we call the anti-access area denial system. We're seeing parts of that system play out. By the way, Russia was one of the countries that kind of pioneered in this area, and their surface-to-air missile systems are very good. And of course, that's what Ukraine is using right now. So you're definitely going to want effectors in different domains converging or coming together in the air domain to create the effect of mutual denial. It probably looks like a change in the cost benefit calculus. So we want to get to the point where we're shooting a missile at something is more expensive than taking the missile shot. That's the radical difference right there, because typically we have been thinking about using air power in ways that involve very exquisite platforms and capabilities that are very expensive. And a missile or sets of missiles, or even a dozen missiles coming at, are much cheaper than that one particular platform. We're trying to turn that around, and we think we can. And when that happens, it has the potential to change the entire return on investment for both our adversary and for us. And we are seeing that as being a key pioneering area that we have to get into. We have to lead in this area. And this gets after the idea of leveraging autonomy, artificial intelligence, and understanding what the value of human-machine teaming really is in the air. And we're heading forward in all of those areas, led by both our Secretary Kendall, and our Chief, General Brown.
Excellent. So I want to pick up on something you said, which is very interesting, which is it almost doesn't matter what domain it comes from in terms of the fires. It's the effect that matters. And that kind of gets at this, one of the themes about how the boundaries between the air and the land domains are increasingly blurred. And as you said earlier, being able to exploit that is really important. And in our series, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Cruiser, talks about this and sort of calls for a new force employment model, particularly for the deep fight. And we do see the Army, in particular, developing more deep strike capabilities, not to mention, also using more of the airspace, lower altitude airspace for loitering munitions and ISR, which I think raises a question: is the Air Force destined to become a force that operates only at the middle altitude and ranges? And do we need to start thinking about a change to roles and missions for the Air Force and Army? Is it time for another Key West agreement?
Ooh, okay. So Kelly, I'll start with, I always think that we are too reticent to talk about roles and missions. They ought to be fluid and evolve as warfare evolves. We have typically not wanted to do that because we don't want to open the can of worms between the services and everything. I get that, and I see why that has the potential for consternation, but in the end, it's good for us to debate who should do what, and I'd like to see more of it. To get at the idea of air-land battle and what air-land battle looks like in the future, I do think we are seeing things in Ukraine that really help us with this. I think what Mike was able to do is to really bring into question the idea of you might call them very rough deconfliction measures. And clearly the use of rough deconfliction measures, I think we're seeing Russia use these right now, right? I think we are seeing them use what you might call crude deconfliction measures, and not very much caring about some parts of that. I suspect that is hurting them. I suspect that if they were able to be more fluid in the way that they combine their effects, it'd be much better for them. And that gets to this idea of domain agnosticity, if that's a word. You do not want to care about where your sensing comes from, and you don't want to care where your effects come from. Increasingly, the way of warfare that is going to be successful is going to be the types of warfare where you are domain agnostic. And clearly Russia isn't there yet. And we're seeing their weakness in that, and that they have to resort to a grinding war of attrition when that happens. I suspect that when we field an air-ground team, that would include us, the Army, and all the other services, the way that we're going to learn and grow in our doctrine and in the way we fight is going to be a much more fluid conception of the battle space. You have to conceive of the battle space in many different ways. And one of the ways of conceiving of the battle space, which I think is going to go the way of the dinosaurs, this idea of ownership of the battle space. And you're going to want to use the battle space. You're not going to want to own the battle space. And so what I think that means is that we have the potential for much more effective fire support control measures, meaning real-time deconfliction of our fires. And I think we can do that. In fact, there are some programs that we are investing in today that help us use machine learning and the algorithmic power of machines to clear out fires and clear out effects so that we don't engage each other, but we're not constrained with something as crude as a fire support coordination line. We're going to find that that's more of a limiter than a help in future conflict. I actually think we found that out in 2003 Gulf War, the Iraq War, and I don't think it's gotten any better. I think, in fact, what we've got to do is find ways of using the battle space much more efficiently, and I think we can through the use of much more fluid control measures.
Does that when you talk about fluid control measures, I understand you're talking more about sort of the programs being developed for real-time sort of command and control coordination. Does that also involve a change in concepts to something more potentially like composite warfare for the Army and Air Force, or some version of that?
So yes, it certainly involves the technical ability to, say, for example, clear fires real time. But I think it is deeper than that. You're getting at that. So it's that doctrinally, we're not going to find it helpful to delineate too much between domains. I think some of the people listening have studied history, and they'll read things like we had an air campaign in Desert Storm. Okay, maybe we did. I'm not sure that I would even. It's probably an air and space campaign with a lot of special operations and some ground preparation involved. But this idea of thinking of campaigns in domains is very likely to not be the case in the future. We're very likely to think about the ways that we go trans-domain and the fluidity of the domains. Our doctrine needs to be able to support that. But the doctrine between us and the Army has got to be able to support that. When we play war games, we find that the only way to win is to be able to do these things in a much more team-like way, is to think of the domains we're still going to need the specialization of the domains. The physics of flying a satellite are very different than the physics of sailing in a submarine. But in the end, you're not going to care. And our doctrine has to be able to reflect that change in modern warfare.
Excellent. I think, one of the other things that sort of came out of this series as well is this sort of notion of a return to mass. And you spoke about that a little bit earlier, particularly if you are thinking about mutual air denial, that's sort of a continuous thing that you have to keep up, right? There's not sort of a decisive battle that takes place. It's continuous, which means more towards attrition. Conrad Crane, I think, raises some legitimate concerns about the replacement capacities of the US Air Force if it were to have to fight that kind of war of attrition. Is that a concern? And how is the Air Force adapting potentially to that reality?
Yes, Kelly, it's absolutely a concern. As we look and we see where our force design goes in the future, we see an increasing likelihood that the first fait accompli type maneuver is stalled out. Then you get to the what's next question. And what's next could be a grinding war of a lukewarm war around the globe between superpowers that would last for years and not necessarily net a whole lot of gain. That would be bad for both sides. We don't want that, but it might happen anyway. If it did, we have to think about what we can scale. It seems really difficult to scale some of the more exquisite capabilities. I'm going to put at the very top of that our operators. It's hard to mass produce great operators. And that includes not only pilots, but it's special operators, key operators on the ground at sea, in space, and scaling that in a war of attrition is going to be really, really hard. In addition, the exquisite platforms in all the domains, very unlikely to see that scale. What might scale? I think this idea of the democratization of flight has the potential to feed into what scales. So what is scaling today? Well, it certainly looks like some sort of autonomous aircraft that are using the air littorals seem to be something that might scale. There are several manufacturers that I'm aware of today in the United States, not counting around the globe with our allies and partners, that can produce these things. We would need all of them to go after that. In addition to that, I also think there's a chance that software can scale. We're clearly seeing DevOps scaling in ways we've never seen before. So if you put those two together, you might have autonomous flight plus software, so that if the autonomous vehicle is so flexible, every day you have a different autonomous vehicle because you load new software in it. We could probably scale that. And if so, then we've got to be able to lay the foundations for that, not only the technical foundations, but the doctrinal and the organizational foundations, in case we do need to scale that in a modern war of attrition. I think that might be the way we would want to go.
I have to ask, as someone who's spent the last 5.5 years, as a professor, teaching military officers at your university, I did have the sense, though, that manned flight is very much at the core of the identity of the Air Force still. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see the Air Force, innovating, adapting its identity and its sort of, culture to this new character of war?
Well, you've asked a very difficult question. And to say that there aren't some cultural artifacts that stand in the way would not be true. Every military has some degree of conservatism that dominates its leadership. That's normal, that's natural, and in fact, in most cases, it's good. But it's not terribly good when you're in the interwar period and things are progressing very, very rapidly, and you don't have a lot of chance to test what those technical progressions, what the doctrinal progressions, and putting it all together and testing it in the field. It's hard to do that. This is why learning from Ukraine is so important. Is we get a chance to examine what's really happening. So slowly over time, our service and the rest of the Department of Defense is changing in its view of uncrewed autonomous flight. It's clearly becoming something that is affecting the battle space. I have had ground commanders look at me and say the thing they're most concerned about are drones flying above them and their people, and that we have to find ways of addressing that. Now, that was unexpected for me. I mean, to have the commander of one of our storied ground divisions to say that to me is kind of a very sobering thing. People are waking up to it, though, and we will adapt. We will get there. It'll be slow. It won't be linear. Never is. Learning's not linear. But over time, you're going to see us adapt and change. And I want to see us lead in this area. Now, I believe that one of the key areas of change management is leadership. I think that's proven in the doctrine and in the literature. And we are so fortunate that our Secretary Kendall, our Chief, General Brown, are leading us in this way. So I'm not going to discount that. If we didn't have that, I'd be much more pessimistic. We do have that, and that makes me somewhat optimistic about our ability to change.
Excellent. As we're closing in on our time together, I just want to sort of ask, what is the one lesson that you really hope the U.S. Air Force might take away from observing the war in Ukraine? And does it apply at all to the Indo-Pacific?
Whoa, it's always difficult to identify one. But I'm going to go back to something that I said before. All military professionals, that includes airmen, guardians, soldiers, sailors, Marines, our allies and partners, we better understand logistics in this conflict. If we don't, we have the potential of wishing a problem away that is not going to go away. Logistics is hard. Achieving logistical support for a war of this intensity is hard. I don't see it being any less intense in the Pacific if we had to go fight. And so I am absolutely dedicated. Our people are dedicated to thinking through logistical challenges and what it looks like when we're contested in our logistics. No, by the way, we're going to contest the other side too, right? They don't get a free pass on logistics. We are going to absolutely attack their logistics. That doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, but in the full depth, we're going to attack logistics, and we're going to make it really, really hard to do offensive maneuvers against our friends. I would hope that our potential adversary, China, might think about that. If they are contemplating the difficulty of getting across a 90-mile strait and going against Taiwan, I would hope that they would realize we're not going to just let their logistics flow. We're going to do everything we can to stop it and make that one of the most difficult military operations in history. And I think we have a chance to do that.
Thank you. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation and very illuminating. I've learned a tremendous amount and enjoyed speaking with you. And so thank you very much for that, General. We really appreciate your time this morning. And I will turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Wetzel for the panel.
Good morning to most of you. Good evening here from the Republic of Korea. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tyson Wetzel. I was a 2021-2022 Air Force Fellow for the Scowcroft Center. I'm now back to my day job, if you will, as an active duty officer in the United States Air Force. As such, I need to start by saying that the opinions that I expressed either in my article that was part of this series or in this panel are my own and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force. as I began, just a couple of thank yous. First off to Lieutenant General Highnote. He's considered to be one of the big thinkers in our service and leading us forward as we look at what the future of air warfare will look like and the future of all domain operations. I think over the last 30 minutes or so, you got to see why many of us in the service continue to believe that we are in good hands with thought leaders like General Highnote. To Dr. Kelly Grieco, thanks for moderating that. Tough when you could probably spend the whole 90 minutes we have here today just with General Highnote. I thought she did an excellent job of hitting on some of the major topics. I also wanted to thank the Scowcroft Center and the Atlantic Council for putting on this event, for putting together this excellent panel, and for putting out the series. So Kelly and I pitched a series a couple of months ago, and the Scowcroft Center leadership just bought into immediately to what we were doing, and I really appreciate that. And I think did an outstanding job of putting out this series. Thank you, not on this call, but to Julia Siegel. She was a major part in getting this across the finish line and getting these 14 articles out. We're going to continue putting some more out. If you haven't had a chance to check out the website, I'd highly encourage you to. Julia and Kelly wrote the intro article that talks about the 5 major themes and what we should be learning from the Ukraine air war. I really think that it's excellent. And so with that said, we have less than an hour with this panel, and it's a pretty impressive panel. So I definitely want to get to it right now. Our first panelist is retired Air Force General Philip Breedlove. General Breedlove retired after spending nearly 4 decades as an Air Force officer. He's an F-16 pilot by trade. The general commanded at every level in the service before being named the 17th Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, leading all NATO military forces. He was dual-hatted as a commander of U.S. European Command. General Breedlove, as mentioned, is a board director for the Atlantic Council. He's written and spoken extensively on the Ukraine air war. He's also doing double duty for us today at the Atlantic Council at noon today. He's going to be a panelist on another discussion entitled, "Can a Ukrainian counteroffensive turn the tide in Russia's war?" Pretty interesting as well. So if you are playing hooky for the day, be great to watch both of these. Our second panelist is author and defense futurist, Mr. August Cole. Mr. Cole began his career as a journalist focusing on defense industrial issues. In 2015, he co-authored Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next war with Peter Singer. The book was a sensation within defense circles, became a New York Times bestseller. It's stark predictions for the future of warfare, which I just reread it this weekend, sounded eerily similar to what General Highnote was talking about, where we want to go. But it really was a wake-up call within the U.S. military. He and Singer also just released a couple of years ago, Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution. He is a non-resident senior fellow in the forward defense practice in the Scowcroft Center. And finally, Lieutenant General Verlin Jameson retired from the U.S. Air Force in 2019 after serving as the first Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance, and Cyber Effects Operations. General Jameson is a career intelligence officer who served nearly 37 years in uniform while on active duty, and since her retirement, she has spoken and written extensively on the future of defense intelligence. She is a vocal proponent of open source intelligence, or OSINT, and publicly available information. That's enough talking for me. You want to hear from the panelists, so let's get right into it. General Breedlove, sir, I'd like to start with you. Unique position having a former SOCIer here. You spent 3 years leading NATO forces and certainly looking a lot at Russia. I just wanted to, I know this is a series on the air war, but I wanted to start big picture with you. The war came as a little bit of a surprise to many of us who thought that Russia would be a little bit better. They certainly have struggled a bunch. What is the reason for that? Is it poorly planned, poorly executed, a combination of such? Why do you think Russia has struggled so mightily against a numerically overmatched Ukrainian force?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. A fabulous conversation with Q Highnote, and a few of the themes he brought up are going to resonate in what I'll say. So we have to remember, first of all, this was a completely contrived war. Russia had goals well outside of Ukraine. If you remember the 2 documents they asked us to sign, literally they told us to sign or there would be consequences. They laid out a sort of a readjustment of the entire security architecture of Europe, reestablishing essentially a Soviet Union and a Warsaw Pact-like buffer zone where they would have the primacy in both politics and in force structures. And so to that effect, we see that Russia and the rest of the world made some really big mistakes right up front. And I think maybe General Jameson will talk to that more about how we got some of this wrong. Russia clearly did not understand what was going on inside of Ukraine, and they planned for the wrong war. And to Q's thoughts, they completely got the logistics wrong. Not only did they lay out too broad and dispersed an attack pattern, but they didn't have the logistics to fight past a few days because they made the judgment this would be over quickly. Some of their troops took their dress uniforms for parades. And essentially, when you start behind the 8 ball because you've made some bad assumptions, it's really hard to move past that. The world judged Ukraine wrong. Again, everybody's brought it up. We thought they would fall quickly. And what we weren't watching and what President Zelensky told me 8 days before the war started, you all haven't been paying attention to us. You've been watching Russia. And we are prepared. We've worked on a defense in depth, and we saw how that played out. And then finally, I think that we made some mistakes in our judgments on Russia, in that up until about 12 days before the war started, the entire tune of conversation in Washington, D.C. is they're not going in. And then we got to some very excellent intelligence that told us otherwise. And our tune played out pretty quickly, and our allies didn't buy our tune. So all of these things put us into a war that we were unprepared for, and frankly, Russia was unprepared for. And really the only country that had been preparing and went unnoticed was Ukraine. Russia's strategic goals have not been met. They wanted to depose Zelensky quickly or take the country quickly, install their puppet government, and then move on to other nations, as was outlined in the 2 documents they sent us to sign. Again, Ukraine was the first step in many. And so their strategic goals were not met. They suffered what some call an operational, others actually call a strategic defeat in the north, and they've had to reset the whole business. And their reset was too quick, incomplete, and they've entered into a fight in the east that they really weren't prepared for yet either. And I think a great conversation to have. I love this conversation about mutual denial. I think that, or air denial, mutual denial. I think it's a good conversation to have. I think as a result of the mutual denial, in that Ukraine performed much better than expected, and Russia failed in many things it needed to do to take control of the battlefield. We have mutual denial has taken us into an ugly attrition warfare. And that's where we find ourselves today. And I think that part of our conversation should be, as Q said, in some cases, there are places where we might want to seek this form of warfare. I would offer that there are some places where we do not want to seek this kind of warfare. And we would want to be able to extend some of the more traditional approaches of air superiority, air dominance, and frankly, the ability to do combined arms warfare, which neither Russia nor Ukraine are getting right at this point. I think I'll leave it there. That might be a bit provocative, but we'll move out.
Well, so there's definitely a lot there, and we will come back to a lot of that. I do think you pointed out both Russian failures and Ukrainian excellence, really. I think we can learn from both of them. And that's one of the points that I tried to make in my article, is we should be looking at both sides. And to look at kind of the Ukrainian side, I wanted to turn over to August. So I would say the way the Ukrainians have fought did not exactly play out, or certainly the way the Russians fought did not play out the way that you and Peter Singer wrote in Ghost Fleet, and that's maybe still a little bit in the future. But I do see some hints of some of the things that you all were talking about, in particular, remotely piloted aircraft, small unmanned aerial systems and drones, starting to hint at automation and AI-enabled systems. What have you seen in this war that tells you we are moving into that kind of futuristic war that you all really kind of enlightened us in the U.S. military on 7 years ago?
Well, first, congrats to the report's authors, to Dr. Greco, and to you, Lieutenant Colonel Wetzel, and Scowcroft Center for putting together exactly the kind of perspective we need right now. And for someone like me who's thinking about conflict in the 2020s and 2030s, it's totally invaluable. So kudos. Yeah, when it comes to the future, there is a lot to draw from, with this conflict. And, the lessons learned to me are myriad. One of the things I'm always thinking about is how old and new fit together. Here we have, trenches like being surveilled by CubeSats whose imagery is being analyzed by, neural nets. And then at the same time, you've got narrative operations, like actually shaping military outcomes. And similarly, economic warfare is significant. Resources matter in weaponizing oil and gas access, and that actually may be more impactful than weaponizing capital flows, as the West has found. But when it comes to small unmanned systems or drones, it's an incredibly interesting conflict and kind of case study. We're kind of in this like what almost feels like a Part 107 paradox, referring to those FAA rules about you're not supposed to fly above 400 feet, et cetera, where that near airspace is incredibly valuable and important for kind of tactical advantage for narrative, right? I mean, think about the drone videos that populate social media. They come from low altitude. And yet near space and like low Earth orbit are also just as vital in and around a theater of operations. And so there's this, kind of vast altitude, between the two, where you're looking from like 400 feet up to, essentially the exosphere. And there's real questions about its viability because it can be so contested because of the access and area denial systems we see in the Pacific and of course in Ukraine. What General Highnote was just talking about in the sort of mutual denial model is a really, I think, thought-provoking thread that people should pull. Similarly, how we learn about these conflicts is really critical. The U.S. has been training Ukrainian forces in different capacities for years, and clearly we can see it's time to do some learning back from them, real time or post-conflict. And not just for our regular warfare forces, but I think for the conventional forces, to your point about small drones, having that tactics and procedures, passed back is going to be, I think, critical for thinking about the kinds of conflicts, not just in the Pacific, but elsewhere around the world where we might find friction with China. And a lot of that learning, too, is going to come from data, right? And, it's OSINT, it's proprietary. And to me, this has to be, I think, one of the most datafied conflicts we've seen. Given the location, given the way we're seeing social media and space used, electronic warfare, just the logistics side of this being so vital. That data has to be a priority, right, for the U.S. and NATO. And it's a job that's going to be a huge challenge trying to get those data sets to fit together, to categorize it, to share it, whatever. But it has to be done. And to me, it speaks to this kind of broader trend that when wars end in the future, we're not going to be deciding borders or political leadership or territory, but really who controls and accesses the data from that conflict. And I think that's a chance for us with this to get ahead of that. So the other aspect in kind of using my narrative story, telling hat is, these trends of affordable space, homebrew, close air support, kinetic drones, avoiding capabilities. The key question, though, again, from a U.S. and an air power perspective, is can it scale, right? To our kind of system. And I think that's one of the biggest questions we've seen emerge because the use cases are clear. But even if you take the platform destroying capability of an individual and can network it together, that's very disruptive on the battlefield. But that's also very disruptive at a defense industrial level. That's also very disruptive at a political military level. And I think it's really important to think those things through. And finally, I think I would say that one of the really intriguing threads that's been woven through how I think about future of air warfare and warfare in general was picked up by Zachary Kallenborn and this narrative in air fusion, where you're seeing essentially the intersection of information operations and robotic and semi-autonomous systems. And that's like almost like a double-barreled capability that has to be, I think, thought of in a kind of cohesive way. They're not independent. Messaging matters, whether it's looking at on the ground side, the St. Javelin campaign to kind of shape, how we understand the kind of potency of the Ukrainian armed forces, to the way that's been able to shape crowdfunding. Lithuanians buying a TB2 for the Ukrainians is a really interesting example. And so I think that's something that also has to be seen as a portend for future conflicts where the U.S. will be involved directly or indirectly as something like this.
A lot there. Datafied conflict. I had to write down. Love that. And that's a pretty good transition to General Jameson. So. General Jameson, General Breedlove talked about intelligence kind of at the strategic level, and in particular how the U.S. was trying to alert the world that this war was going to happen. So you have a kind of competing narrative on the effectiveness of intelligence, some people saying that US intelligence community was incredibly successful, right? They were huge predictive capabilities on what was going to happen, yet kind of failed in the overall assessment. General Milley testified that this could be over in a week, less than 2 weeks before the war kicked off. So do you see this as an intelligence success or an intelligence failure, or a little combination of the two?
Well, thank you very much. First, I also want to echo thanks to the Atlantic Council, the Scowcroft Council, Tyson, you, and my fellow panelists. This is a great opportunity to participate in an extremely rich discussion. But to the issue at hand, the strategic warning that the United States was able to provide Ukraine and valued partners in NATO, I believe was a huge achievement. The ability and confidence to provide such detailed information to Ukrainian demonstrated to me the depth and willingness of the US to partner with a vulnerable democracy. I also believe that the downgrading of intelligence coupled with an intensive drive for intel sharing should be the new benchmark for future crises where our national interests are at stake. Let's really dive into what exactly did we do that was, I believe, a huge success. And I think just the fact that the US was able to inform the Ukrainian president in advance of an invasion that his country would actually be invaded is a huge success. Now we can take the other side and say whether the nation or the NATO nation's leaders chose to believe the information or doubted aspects of it, to me is not really the issue. If you really go back as far as early December, the White House was putting out in the press that Russia was finalizing plans to invade Ukraine. It got the world in a global discussion, thought, and interest on a nation that probably would not have garnered so much attention. I think it's also important if we take a look at what were some of the environmental pressures that were going on in late 21 and early 22. And let's take a look at it from the Ukrainian side. And if I look at what were the most that come to my mind, the president was dealing with numerous internal issues, to include extremely low popular support. And a lot of this was due to the population seeing his inability to reduce tensions and possible conflict with Russia, counter to the platform that got him elected. Whether those issues and others clouded his judgment, while many second guess and believe they have, I don't know if that has yet to be determined. But I think that what has been glossed over is his performance and his ability to galvanize various world leaders and garner their country's support alongside the performance of the nation in the last 6 months. And I believe all of that more than makes up for any shortfalls that we might have seen of his prior to the war. I think that General Breedlove and August did mention from the Russian side what was going on. And I think that General Breedlove did a great job of communicating the strategic information ploy that Russia and Putin was giving to the globe. I think his shortfall was that he was isolated from his military, the Duma, and his population. He was really caught up in the COVID outbreak and what might happen with the pandemic. His inability to strategically outline to his own population, his own military, and his own government of his objectives and operational goals in preparation to the invasion, to me, is proving far more costly for him than at any other time in his tenure. And while that had been his mode of operations, we're seeing at scale how it is playing out. And finally, your last part of the question, as for the rapid advancement in Kyiv, I think everyone, all around the globe, underestimated the will and the grit of Ukrainian people. And I will tell you, it is extremely difficult to assess the heart of a nation when they are in crisis. And it doesn't matter how good your intelligence is, if you are not one with the culture, with many locations on the ground to feel and interpret those feelings, you probably are not going to get that assessment correct. While I'm no longer in the intelligence community, intelligence assessments are just that. They are based on best intelligence information at the time. And intelligence analysis is not 100% gain. It never has been, it most likely never will be. When we get it great, people don't say much. When we get it wrong, it's an abject failure. I don't believe that this has been an abject failure. I do believe there are many successes that we all need to learn from.
And there's a lot there that I would really want to get into as a fellow intelligence officer. I do think there was great successes at the strategic level. And I think at the tactical level, you are seeing Ukraine leverage intelligence much more effectively than Russia. And they have been able to negate the superiority in numbers and firepower of the Russians because they have been able to really direct where they want to fight, when they want to fight on their own terms. And a lot of that is due to intelligence. I mean, look at the campaign to take out senior officers. Russia doesn't want to cross a bridge anymore. I think that the use of intelligence has been a real comparative advantage for Ukraine over Russia. So to the audience, keep those questions coming in. I'm going to have one more round with the panelists before I get to your questions, and we'll do kind of a quick around the horn on the questions that you're sending in. But I wanted to go to General Breedlove for the next question, really specific on the air war. So, sir, we've already talked about the fact that there have been Russian failures and Ukrainian successes, and we can learn from both. So just a kind of a big, softball question here, if you will. What do we need to learn from those Russian failures and the Ukrainian successes that will help the United States and its allies and partners be better in the future in the application of air and space power?
Well, thank you. And I don't want to sound flip, but maybe we haven't learned anything from them. Maybe we're just re-observing things that we have learned in the past. And I think this is an interesting way to look at this air denial concept that's coming up. So, as you said, Ukraine has overperformed. They prepared well, as General Jameson has pointed out. We gave them some really great intelligence. They are using it well, and they have their own really excellent intelligence based around on-the-ground human and other things. And so they have used that well to establish what I think we've been talking about in this air denial approach to this war, and it has worked well for them. And I think all the things that we talked about this morning with Q and others will help us to form how we might use that in the future. But part of the reasons that the Ukrainians did well in air denial sort of approaches is because of the abject failure of the Russians. We had thought that they could do SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense. They have proven that they cannot, at least to a level that allows them to employ air power effectively over the battlefield. We had thought that they knew how to incorporate air power into their combined arms attacks in Ukraine. They have not. They have proven unable of linking things together. Again, the discussion with Q and others about how we have to be really good at linking our effects, and that it's not about domains, it's about how we fluidly use these effects. Russia proved incapable of doing that. And so what we have is an air war that has succeeded to a certain degree on the Ukrainian side and failed abjectly on the Russian side. And that has changed the character of what we see in this conflict in front of us. When we see this, where these capabilities that air power brings to the battlefield denied on both sides, we have fallen into an ugly mishmash of World War I, World War II, trench line, attrition, artillery-based warfare, and the discriminate use of that kind of attrition-based work, meaning high precision ground strikes, left the battlefield fairly early because Russia's run out of that capability. And we in the United States didn't give that capability to Ukraine until very late in the war as far as long range fires. And so I think what we need to do is, because of the absence of the combined arms effects that air power brings to the battlefield, this war is very different than we've seen in so far. And we have taken some pretty large steps backward in how warfare is being contained and used. I really think we need to focus on some things that we learned a long time ago, and that is how important it is for over our battlefield, we're able to project air superiority to allow air forces of all services, not talking about domains, air power, to bring precise, sustained precision to the battlefield. All of these discussions about bridges would have been over had we had decisive, precise airfield over the battlefield. That force that was stuck in the mud on the north side of Kyiv, which eventually moved, refurbished, reset, and came to fight in the east, would not have ever fought in the east if we'd have had air superiority and precise air power over the northern battlefield. That force would have been eliminated and never would have seen the fight in the Donbass. So I think there's some really good things to learn here about how Ukraine used a lesser force to accomplish this air denial and make that work for them. But I also believe we have to understand the failure of the Russian forces and what that has meant to how this war has been carried on. Thanks.
Hey, sir, just one brief follow-up from Jack Krapansky asks, is air power in Ukraine likely to be decisive, or will it be another tool in the toolkit and not decisive? It seems like from your answer there at the end that it's not been decisive because it was not a combined arms fight from the beginning.
I completely agree with your summation. It is not going to be decisive unless we change Ukraine's ability, and you know that's not going to happen fast. So I don't see that in the short near future at all. And I don't see Russia overcoming their inability to do seed and to more effectively use air power in the battle. They have fallen back to this attrition-based, non-precise, grinding artillery style of warfare because they're unable to do anything else.
I will tell you, one of the reasons for us wanting to write this is to really try and not only identify lessons, but learn from them. Had the Russians done something like we're doing now in 2008, after a relatively unsuccessful air campaign in Georgia, where they lost a lot of aircraft to relatively legacy or low technology air defenses, they probably would have developed a seed game plan that would have worked a little bit better. I don't think they learned much from 2008. And I think they are really starting to, or not starting, I think that really hurt in the battle for air superiority at the beginning. I want to go over to General Jameson. I heard you speak many times when you were on active duty, and you were an early proponent of open source intelligence and publicly available information. You kind of led our service towards really trying to embrace OSINT and PAI as they are known. This war for me has really been the coming out party for OSINT and PAI in the buildup to the conflict. And actually, it was Google Maps that was a really good indicator the war was kicking off, because there were traffic jams headed south into Ukraine, and battle damage assessment has been being done via OSINT, maybe better than I've ever seen, including with exquisite intelligence sources. So it looks like you've been proven right. Anything that you have seen from this war that says that OSINT and PAI are here to stay and we can use it even more?
Well, thanks. But I think that a couple aspects from what General Breedlove had just said and what Q had said earlier, based on air denial and the lack or the limited capability of the Ukrainian force, they have leaned on an aspect of information warfare. And really, you know, what I think we've learned is that OSINT and PAI, publicly available information, in combination are transforming defense intelligence. But I think it's worth noting, we need to all talk about the same term. So I'm going to use my definition, which may or may not be the US government definition for PAI, publicly available information. And I believe it's found from a number of sources, which are not limited, but composed of social media networks, news outlets, crowdsourced perspectives, microblogging, commercial space products, imagery, and the like, i.e. it is information. OSINT, or open source intelligence, is information taken from unclassified data feeds, such as PAI, but once evaluated using other sources and methods, and when appropriated, it's integrated into an intelligence assessment. In other words, it's the tradecraft of turning information into intelligence. And what is specific to note that we have seen in this war is the proliferation of public intelligence agencies, in addition to governments actually putting out these types of analysis reports. And so I would go back and say, I really think this transformation began decades ago. Really, since Desert Storm, we have seen the publicly available information multiply in its usefulness and availability. And you can really go back to 2008 and the Georgia War and see how PAI played an important role in showing the Georgian side of the conflict and the Russian actions. You would have thought we would have learned and taken a note from some of their behaviors there, but we continue to do so. If we look at it from another aspect, the time that you see the high point of ISIS expansion in Syria and Iraq in 2014 to 2018 timeframe, PAI use on all sides really started to gain ground and world attention, to include inside the US government. So I think we finally started to embrace and say, we don't just need classified information as a part of information warfare, but let's expand our definitions. I also think that technology in the digital age has demonstrated the ease and use and proliferation of apps on smartphones and other devices, making the proliferation of these apps access a global demand. In 2022, PAI usage of apps streaming video, commercial imagery, and chats has allowed all sides to really better understand what is going on day to day. Specifically, I would say as an outsider, if we look at the Ukrainian use of the capability, I think they understand and have taken this aspect to a nuanced, increased level. And what I'm really referring to is, if you look at the various apps, posts, and video from Ukraine, most often they're in English. If you look at the Russian ones, they're almost exclusively always in Cyrillic. World democracies and others have far more English readers than they do Russian readers. And I think that Ukraine has capitalized on getting their message out in this way. But I think the greatest attribute about PAI and OSINT is that it just keeps getting better and better and being instantiated into mainstream. What we thought was cutting edge in 2008 in the Georgia War now is really old hat. And I also want to highlight again the use of public intelligence agencies as an augmentation or as a standalone capability is something that the defense community, the intelligence community is really going to have to debate and discuss on how they want to use it going forward. It will not go away. I believe it will only proliferate. But I'm excited to see where this takes us in the future. I think we are at some nascent stages. I don't think all conflicts are the same, but I see this has got extreme use in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations, as well as future information warfare short of armed conflict.
Thank you, General Jay. Next question to August, and really this is a couple of questions that I'm kind of amalgamating from the audience. So earlier in your answer, you talked about how this war is being disruptive, or changes are being disruptive to the defense industrial level. There have been questions in the chat about going to a strictly UAV-based force. Somebody had a question about, is it too late to change the 24 POM, or what should we be investing? So I just want to take a step kind of up and say, what should the U.S. and its allies and partners, what changes should they make to force structure, or what types of capabilities do you think will bear a lot of fruit in the battlefields of the late 2020s and 2030s?
Those are literally the billion-dollar questions, aren't they? They're great ones.
And that's why we're sending them to you.
So I think, to start, the recognition at an organizational level that, the use of small, autonomous, attritable systems, right, that you don't worry about needing to keep in your inventory, beyond maybe a short period of time, that is here. And yet, we're not at a point where you're seeing a lot of enthusiasm for that, from the larger defense enterprise. There are really interesting experimentation programs. So like, what would you fund in, the 2024 POM? Well, thinking about the challenges we have scaling hardware, right? It's one thing to say, okay, software can, rapidly scale and spread capabilities everywhere in a battlefield, across the battlefield, I should say, or in a force, but the software requires hardware to live in. So how about a crash like drone industrialization program, where you're creating kind of a distributed industrial base for US made, US coded systems that can be shared with allies or integrated immediately into our own systems. The cautionary tale to some extent comes from the Marine Corps and their 2035 transformation, that there's a lot of really strong and hard defended positions on traditional platform capabilities, but for good reason. But the necessities of modern warfare, I think, require that breaking with that. Similarly, I would just add too that the cultural aspects are so crucial. Being able though to find people who are willing to risk, both in the near term, in their peacetime training, to experiment with doctrine, allowing people to have that kind of autonomy to make those kinds of like low consequence mistakes is crucial. We're seeing more war games like that, as General Highnote said. We're seeing more exercises like that integrate a lot of these capabilities, but not nearly enough. And to do a lot more with our allies, so that like the Ukrainians have found, when you're trying to hook up a harm missile to a Soviet era, for a Russian fighter, that there is some ability to do that. And I think that heterogeneity, right, is a really important theme in autonomous systems. Like, we don't want to create, a million drones of the same thing so that they all have to share the same vulnerability or et cetera. So, being able to kind of understand the heterogeneous nature of this next wave of warfare that is both, kind of kludged together, American missile on a foreign jet, to similarly the different kinds of approaches to innovation that come from I think a real kind of diverse set of actors.
Excellent. Going to the questions. So I'm not going to pose this one as a question, but Jack Labonte brought up the National Guard partnership with Ukraine. I really think that's worth bringing up. Just I don't want to take away from what the Ukrainians have done, but they have done. But the U.S. has certainly helped. And the partnership with the National Guard has been really, really helpful to the Ukrainians in building up that professional force, us learning from them learning from us. And I think we would be very lucky to continue to learn from them. General Breedlove, you raised your hand. Anything that you wanted to say about that?
I just wanted to say, and I said it many times when I was European Command Commander, that this state partnership program was my number one engagement and theater shaping tool. And we need to be conscious of our investment in the ability of our state partnership programs to bring along existing NATO allies that are still struggling with some things, as well as partners like Ukraine.
Yep. As a native Californian, I love the work that our California Air National Guard did. It's great to hear from a combatant commander how important the state partnership program was for you and the capabilities that you commanded. Okay, one of the major themes from all of the from the 14 articles that we produced was about the democratization of air and space power and intelligence. So I'm going to do kind of a lightning round here. General Breedlove, you're on my screen, so I'm going to send this one over to you. There's been a lot of talk about mutual air denial. I think as proponents of U.S. and allied air power, we would not be willing to just accept mutual air denial. I think we still believe in the requirement for air superiority, air dominance. When we're talking about the democratization of air power through things like small, attritable, remotely piloted aircraft, et cetera, it may be more difficult in the future to establish air superiority, but I think it's certainly required from the joint force for the U.S. Air Force to establish air superiority. What do you think the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force and its allies and partners need to do to ensure that they will be able to provide the joint and combined force air superiority going forward?
Well, I think you kind of answered your own question in the way you asked it. I do embrace this air denial in situations where we don't believe we can win outright, or we need another approach that is more affordable as far as force structure, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we have a lot to learn from the Ukrainians and how they did it. But as I said in my remarks, part of the reasons for the Ukrainian success is the Russian failure. And I don't think we want to find ourselves in a place where we are unable to push at least local or battlefield air superiority over our forces so that they can do the work that they need to do. I would not want to go forward to try to win some sort of combined arms campaign, accepting that air denial was going to be what was over my head. So I do believe it has great applicability in the future, like Q and others talked about in some theaters where we may not be able to push forward air superiority. But having three kids out of 3 kids and 2 sons-in-law, all 5 are either in the military and working for the military. I wouldn't want to push them into combat with air deniability above them. I would want to push them into combat with air supremacy or air superiority.
Excellent. So ma'am, over to you. Let's talk about the democratization of intelligence capabilities. You talked about it a lot in talking about the distinction between PAI and OSINT and how we are continuing to develop. I'm wondering what that means for the U.S. as it fights wars in the future. Is information dominance or superiority and the associated decision advantage that comes with that, is that still possible in a world of really, really capable OSINT sources or OSINT, open source intelligence?
Yeah, I think that this is going to warrant some heavy debate and discussion, and it will lead to increased training and integration. I do agree with General Breedlove. Based off of some of the monumental Russian failures, we have always characterized their ability for information dominance and information superiority as the premier capability. And I think that Ukraine has shed light on not necessarily so. While they might have command of scale of their perspective, when it comes to the ability with today's tools and access globally with apps and publicly available information, you can really start to whittle away at what is truth and what is deception. I think it's going to increase the need for our training throughout all the military, not just in the intelligence sector, but clearly with ops and intel joined at the hip. But I think that Ukraine has demonstrated if you actually mass the information and just put it out live as it's happening, you can garner the truth and garner support for that. We don't do such a good job at that. We have got to learn on how to ensure that publicly available information is valued. And I'm not saying just take it for face value in its raw component. However, when you have multi-feeds coming at you, the verification and veracity of the information is there, you can then start to inform, indicate, and warn, and then become integrated into assessments. We don't spend any real money on our training or education of this. We also don't do it for our civilians in the intelligence community. we really still go through the traditional INTs and really focus most of our training on that. We've got to expand, we've got to trust, and we've got to integrate. Our new generations are very familiar with apps that clearly my generation hasn't even heard of. You're going to have to get to how do you identify what is malware, what is not, what is truth, what is false. But these are all doable things if we actually learn the lesson that open source and publicly available information is a means and a toolkit for information warfare.
All right, we are down to the last 10 minutes, so truly implementing the lightning round. Great question from a council member, Byron Callan. Are there any lessons or observations from the war that you believe are incorrect or overstated? So that's to anybody that wants to answer. Anything that you think is being overstated?
I'll just leap into this. On the logistics side, if you can imagine that we were trying to land U.S. aircraft with javelins on board inside Ukraine near contested areas, that'd be very different than how we're conducting our resupply now. And I think it's easy to look at the success we're having at our massive material airlift and the distribution that's happening, but recognizing that in some of the other potential scenarios this decade, particularly those in the Asia-Pacific region, we are going to have to move our aircraft that are bringing, again, equipment and people from the U.S., quite close to conflict and closer. So across vast distances, right? The density of the operating environment in that part of Europe is something that we can use to our advantage and have been. It's going to be quite different in other parts of the world.
General Breedlove or General Jameson, anything to add?
I would just agree with most of what August just said. I would take a little different tact on that. We are having tremendous successes. In fact, most of the folks that I talk to on the ground there are a lot of the problems they're having with getting equipment and resupply to the border or to the fight is because it's dropped off so far away from the fight. And I think that we're going to have to think in future combats, as August said, about our ability to be able to push further forward with resupply. And we missed a couple opportunities in this conflict to do that. And that was primarily based on policy decisions, not limitations of military capability.
I would agree with what my fellow panelists have said. And in a provocative statement, I would also say, I don't believe the United States has actually set its objectives for outcomes that it actually desires. So I think that really we continue to relearn this lesson in every conflict, and I think we have to take it to heart.
General Breedlove, go ahead.
I'm in violent agreement with what Dash just said. We as a nation have not set our objectives. We've actually talked about this very recently. We had a period where we set some real concrete objectives: defeat Russia, regain territory, et cetera, and then we quickly backed away from those statements and we've distanced ourselves from that. And that's why I brought up the policy thing in my remarks just a moment ago. Parts of the outcome of this war are being driven by policy decisions as opposed to limitations on our abilities or the abilities of Ukraine. And I think that's playing out in spades right now in the counteroffensive, and how that has been the basis for that and the structure for that has been set truly by Western powers and how they're feeding things to Ukraine versus not feeding things to Ukraine, how slowly some things are moving and other things are moving. It's really a policy decision how that counteroffense is really going down there. And so I think that sadly, and I'll stop with this, sadly, we are so appreciative of what our government has done for Ukraine. We're so appreciative of what the Congress has done for Ukraine. And we're so appreciative that the American people are still supporting this flow of stuff to Ukraine. But what we need to understand is we're celebrating the numerator in this fraction. The denominator in this fraction is set by exactly what General Jameson just said, our objectives. So we celebrate all these things, but we don't ever look at those in basis against what is required. And I think if we really had a set of hard objectives for a Ukraine, that would drive the denominator, and then we would truly understand how good this fraction is or how bad this fraction is.
So, sir, if the administration changed policy tomorrow and said the clear objective is to expel Russia from all Ukrainian lands, what are, and we're specifically talking about the air war, so do you think there are airborne or air capabilities that could help the counteroffensive meet that objective? I think it maybe is just the easy answer to say, give them, Vipers or whatever, but what are things that you think would help?
I wouldn't answer it first in the air. I would answer it first in the ground. And
Okay.
having had some visibility into the plans for wars like this in Europe, if a NATO force or a US force was doing this fight, we would have battalions upon battalions of MLRS with ATACMs in their firing. And instead we fed them 12 firing units, not platoons, not battalions, but 12, maybe now up to 16 firing units. And we haven't given them the longest and the most precise capability. So I think that there are things that we could nearly immediately do to better enable them. And they've done such a great job in this air deniability or denial concept. Why wouldn't we reinforce that with some good medium and high range air defenses? We've allowed allies to give them small amounts of Russian type systems, and our Western contribution, the few things we've given them are very visible and vocal, but the density of that is nowhere near the appropriateness to the fight on the ground.
All right, 2 minutes. So I'm gonna, sorry, General Jay, go ahead.
The only thing I would add is I think that we need to realize Ukraine is in a full war and everyone else is in a limited war. And while we haven't set our objectives, I think one of the things that has been very underrated is 100% of Ukrainians are involved in this war, whether they are living in Ukraine or not. And we have not seen this kind of force in 4 or 5 decades when fighting a war. And I think that we have not given enough evaluation to the difference of how the two elements are really playing out. And I just have nothing but utmost respect for all the Ukrainians for what they are able to do, whether they be a 10-year-old, a female running a village, or fighting on the front line. 100% are involved in this war.
Indeed. All right. Last question, then I'm going to go through each of the 3 panelists and try to be respectful of the time. We won't go too far over. The purpose of this panel and this series was not just to look back at the 6 months of the air war, but it was to look forward at what the U.S. and its allies and partners can do to ensure that it remains the greatest air and space power in the globe. So my last question would be, if you were, president for a day, or if there were one change that you could make to the U.S. Air and Space Forces that would help ensure their fighting capability against the strategic competitors, China, Russia, or anybody else that may challenge the established world order, what do you think that is? Is it equipment? Is it a piece of training? Is it doctrine? What kind of changes would you implement? And on that very small, easy to answer question, I'm going to start with August.
I think I would start with people, and I would create far greater incentives, especially for junior and mid-career officers, to be experimental, to push back. Culture has to change before anything else.
And what a good one. And we could have a whole hour on just culture and retaining the right people, training the right people. Really some interesting things that you talk about in Ghost Fleet. There's a guy with a mohawk, and you just kind of got to deal with that, in the new world. that has a certain skill set that you need. General Jameson, I will go over to you. What changes would you make to ensure that the Air Force you love so much is successful going forward?
I think the only way to be successful is for the executive and legislative aspects of our government to unite the people to actually fully support what our military is asked to do. That allows the Air Force then to go on and be the experts and gain air superiority where and when needed.
Well, I didn't figure the answer from anybody would be buy more F-35s, but so far we've got the culture and people and working together with the legislative branch and the executive branch to get the American people moving in the right direction. I think that was different than what I anticipated. General Breedlove, you have the last word. What would you do to ensure the U.S. Air Force's dominance in the air and space battlefields of the near future?
Well, I think that August nailed it. This is and so did Dash. This is about people. So for Ukraine, it would have been nice to have started when some were advocating for them years ago to bring them into 4th and 5th generation capabilities in the air. You don't do this overnight. If we started now, it may not actually play out before this war is actually over. But we need to invest in the air forces of Ukraine, and we need to invest in Ukraine's ability to do combined arms warfare. We had to have law to force us into it, and we're pretty good at it now, but we're not perfect. We still have a ways to go, but we need for Ukraine to understand all those things that Q talked about, getting past rust deconfliction, becoming domain agnostic, better incorporation and deconflictions of fires. All of those things come first with people, with attitude, education, and training, and basically exercising. We build this into a force. We should have started this. We did some great work at Yavriv and training at small unit levels and things, but we didn't really think operationally in the way we've developed people yet in Ukraine, and we need to go there. And for our Air Force, I like one of the things the chief says way back at the beginning of his thing: change or die. You know, we've got to adapt into the future. And I think we need to understand that mass does matter. And, you know, tail numbers matter because tail numbers fill schedules in disparate places. And so these are important things. But I think I would be really reticent if I went away from people and new independent thinking about how we fight.
Indeed. Well, thank you, General Breedlove, General Jameson, August Cole. Thank you to General Highnote previously. Thank you to the Scowcroft Center, the Atlantic Council, Dr. Kelly Grieco, and Julia Siegel, who helped us produce this series. I hope that we continue this conversation. We continue writing about it. This war is providing lots of good learning to ensure that the U.S. and its allies and partners are able to dominate in air and space conflicts in the future. And I hope that we at least contributed a little bit to that conversation. That conversation keeps going, and I think everybody on here would hope that this war comes to a quick and for Ukraine successful conclusion. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it, and please check out the website. We hope that you like some of the articles that were on there. Thank you.